the title of this presentation is An Introduction to Water Governance, and we intend this presentation to cover the following themes. First of all, some definitions. Second, the key aspects of water management. Thereafter, the key elements of water governance, including policies, laws, institutional mechanisms, and means of implementation. And in the end, some concluding remarks to summarize the relationship between water management and water governance. Let me start with the key aspects of water management. Water management can be said that covers a variety of activities and disciplines that can be divided in three main categories. The first one being the management of the resource itself, in this case, water. The second one, the management of the services, the supply, the wastewater treatment, for example. And the third one, the management of the trade-offs that are needed to balance the supply and the demand of water. The importance of water management, you might know, but I will have to insist on that water is a key resource to ensure life on Earth, and crucial, certainly, to guarantee the integrity of ecosystems and to support economic development. With good water management, you can provide clean drinking water and sanitation. With good water management, you can bring hydropower to homes and industry, irrigation for agriculture. With good water management, you can improve the economy of a country, of a region, of a continent. With good water management, you can allow ecosystems to maintain and continue providing the services they provide, including water. With good water management, you can offer opportunities for tourism, for recreation, and finally, last but not least, good water management, you can have good agreements, beneficial agreements with your neighboring countries to govern transboundary or shared resources. You could see, for example, in the slide that I'm presenting, some of the examples, as I mentioned, of good water management, protecting biodiversity, supporting economic activities like tourism, developing infrastructure, and providing safe and drinking water. But what happens when this management is not good? When this management is inefficient? When this management is poor? The region I come from, Argentina, South America, we have had 200 years of pollution in one important river that is in the middle of the city of Buenos Aires, the Matanza-Riachuelo Basin. And this is the result of poor water management. You might know what is going on in Central Asia, you know, the problems around the Aral Sea, part of which derive from poor water management. You might know that in 1986 there was major accident in the River Rhine in Switzerland that polluted and created, you know, a huge environmental catastrophe along the whole river and up to the mouth of the river, which is the Santos chemical spill. Floods are sometimes attributed to poor or bad water management, or also failures in dams are also, not always, but also attributed to poor water management. So that's why I think we need to understand the evolution, historical evolution of water management to see when and how management is or could be more effective, and then understand its relationship with governance. But let me first start with the evolution of water management. And it can be said without making any mistake that water management has been present in societies from ancient times. Present in societies for irrigation, present in societies to build aqueducts, to carry waters to different cities, present in societies to manage fluctuations in flood and drought, present in societies to regulate individual access to water, industrial access to water, agricultural development, and also maintaining good relationships with the neighbors. So to covering the whole spectrum of what management entails. And this is something that has evolved from pre-modern times. Some of you might know that the development of ancient societies in West Asia, Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, in India, were largely the results of the ability of those societies to control and to tame rivers. In other words, to manage the water resources. Particular focus was given in those days, as you might know, to irrigation and flood prevention. But this is something that continued over the years, more recently into the 19th century, in what we can call the industrial modernity. In those days, nature, including water, was or could and should be, it was understood at that time, subject to the mastery of science and industry. And with that idea of modernization, development, there were a series of negative pressures on the resources, including water, that became quite evident in the 1950s. So we can say that industrial modernity had some negative effects over nature and water as well. If we move a bit further closer to our times, in the 1960s and the 1970s, part of this idea of, let's say, the evolution of water management could be called the resources development. This is the time in which water was seen as an engineering, so to say, tool to be developed, the hydraulic mission, the construction of dams, water storages, canals for water distributions, and so on. So there was a strong emphasis on building infrastructure. But also, and at the same time, was a beginning of an important development in terms of international politics, international governance, international law, which is the adoption of the Helsinki Rules of the Uses of Waters of International Rivers, adopted under the auspices of the International Law Association, a technical body of experts that started to analyze, much before the 1960s, the state of the art of the relationships of states as far as shared waters are concerned. And we will probably deal with that in the next seminar next week. But maintain or keep in mind that during that time, during the 60s and during the 70s, the resource, the water, was not only developed with an emphasis of having infrastructural development, but also was, in a way, the beginning of international water law or international water governance. The next stage in the evolution of water management is the time that we can call the late modernity. The late modernity happened between the 70s and the 80s. I mean, this is certainly something that we can discuss, and I don't want you to take this as a mathematical exercise, because we can talk about this in a more flexible way. But let's agree on the fact that between the 70s and the 80s, there is the beginning of this idea of environmental security, of this idea that nature itself cannot necessarily be controlled, and water is an essential resource for providing environmental services. So, in other words, in the 70s and the 80s, we have the ingredients of the beginning of what we can call the environmental awareness worldwide. At that time, we have two important milestones as far as water management and water governance are concerned. which is the Stockholm Conference of 1972, the Stockholm Conference of the Human Environment, which was not necessarily a water conference, but that had an important role in the, let's say, development of environmental awareness and development of environmental governance worldwide, but also the Mar del Plata Water Conference, and the Mar del Plata Water Declaration of 1977. Probably one of the most comprehensive international events relating to water worldwide. Continuing now with this evolution of resource or water management, the next stage is the one that we could call resources management. And this is the time spanning between 1980s and 1990s. You know, in other words, building upon this idea of environmental security and environmental awareness, in this particular stage, we are getting to the point in which it's recognized that water can be overexploited, and therefore the world has to account for the ecological and the social constraints associated to that. As a result, there is an important movement towards regional and national planning instead of only project planning, looking at the demand-side measures that are coming into play. And this is also the time in which an important international document is released, which is the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future, in 1987. And in the photo you see when it was released in the 1987. This, in a way, opened the door for the birth of a concept that many of you, I would say, are familiar with, and this is the concept of integrated water resources management, IWRM. And this is something that comes obviously as a result of this evolution, but primarily in the 1990s. So water management is embedded in this particular moment in time, in overall policy development, in physical planning, considering environmental protection. There is, in this context, a strong focus not only on sustainability, but also on inclusive approaches, on public participation, and so on. And this is, in a way, the concept that we still use nowadays. When I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking also about whether or not we can start already seeing the beginning of new concepts as far as water management are concerned. And you probably might have heard already of this idea of nature-based solutions. So perhaps it's a bit too premature to speak about nature-based solutions to water management as, so to say, the panacea on water management and water governance at this moment in time, but probably in a few more years, we might have to rethink this idea of integrated water management alone. Importantly, in this particular moment in time is to mention that in 1992, the world assisted to a major conference, not necessarily related to water, but that gave an important input to water management and to water governance, which is the Rio Conference on Environment and Development, where 3 important international conventions were adopted. This is all about the evolution of water management. So let's go now, unfortunately, I will say, some definitions. I'm not going to read all these definitions. I'm just going to highlight some of the important elements of that for you to pay attention to that, for you to trigger some questions and some doubts that you might have later on. IWRM is a definition. There is one definition adopted by GWP in the 2000. Most importantly, it is a process, it is said, which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and relating resources. That's the idea of holism integration. And this concept, I think, from a governance perspective is concerned, and before getting into the fourth dimension, is grounded on two important features, which is equity and sustainability. And this is very important for you to remember. Four dimensions are encompassed by this definition of integrated water resource management. First one, the resource, water, and the related resources. The second one are the users of the resource. The third one is the spatial scale in which the resource is looked at. And as the second one is the temporal scale. Remember then, please, the fact that IWRM is defined as a process with four different dimensions and grounded on two important elements that are equity and sustainability. I will make a mistake, so to say, if I do not mention two important conferences, global or international conferences, that relate to one way or the other to integrated water resources management. I mentioned that before when I spoke about the evolution of water management, the Mar del Plata United Nations Water Conference. This is a very, as I said, a very important conference in which the concept of integrated water resources management was not coined yet, but contributed extensively to the development of management, as a whole. There is an important action plan which was adopted at that time, and I can all of you suggest to have a look at that action plan. While adopted in the 1977, still very valid for the challenges that we face nowadays in this field. And the second one is one that you might know, and it is the Dublin Conference that was also convened under the auspices of the United Nations, but to formulate sustainable water policies and action programs to be considered by the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which is under which they adopted, or the UN adopted, the Dublin Statement on Water and Sustainable Development and the four well-known principles. Keeping that in mind, I think that the next topic to insist on before moving in what I would say is my main message today in this webinar is some of the key aspects of IWRM. And some of the key aspects of IWRM, beyond those that I have already referred to, is the fact that IWRM, or the adoption of IWRM at national level, at basin level, at regional level, or international level, requires, at the end of the day, a change in water policies. A change in water policies that look at equity issues, for example, considering water as a basic need, at ecological integrity issues, looking at the fact that water resources can only be sustainable or persist in a natural environment that can regenerate sufficient water of quality, to continue in a way providing the services that are needed for all of us to survive on Earth, and efficiency, because water is a scarce resource. We are going to get back to this point in a couple of more minutes. What I really would like all of you to retain here is IWRM as a concept, as an ideal, as a main stage, the final stage, so to say, in this evolution of water management to be adopted, to have a meaningful implementation requires a change in water policies. And here is the point in time in which I would like to make the bridge or the relationship between management and governance. So here we see how a management concept a management approach to be implemented, requires a change or requires governance. And without anticipating what comes after this, first part of the presentation, let me tell you, and without any doubts, and you might have heard that, it's not only because Alejandro Isa says that the current world water crisis that we experience in many regions around the world is often described as a crisis of governance. Why is it so? And we will unfold that, that statement in a few minutes. But this implies that a way of, in order to tackle the current crises, the current challenges that we experience in many regions around the world, we certainly need to improve governance arrangements. And this is something that many governments or let's say the international community has recognized and have expressed its support in several international policy documents, as you can see there, in the screen, from 2000 all the way until nowadays. I just mentioned, for example, the Hague Declaration on Water Security in 2000, and then many more after that. But in essence, what I would like to say here is that the way of resolving the whole issue of management, the whole issue of good water management, is something that has to be seen also from the lenses of its relationship with governance. In other words, building water governance and building the necessary capacities to implement water governance arrangements is a permanent objective that should be part of the puzzle, integral part of the puzzle, to resolve ultimately the issue of good water management. Here I would like to make a first stop and see if there are any questions or any reactions from your side before we continue unfolding and exploring some of the details of water governance.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I don't know about the participants, but I've definitely been taking notes on this wonderful historical journey on how did we get to where we are today, insofar as understanding the need to manage water, not so much as a resource to just use, but something that requires a real sustainable sort of governance framework. And what I found fascinating is that I come from the natural resource, of course, which water is one, but often is treated differently, natural resource background, and some of the international legal frameworks that you've mentioned are the same that we use, of course, to promote the idea of sustainability in the management of natural resources, especially when it comes to ecosystem management. And water is an ecosystem itself, and it's also what supports a lot of the ecosystem that we deal with, or in fact everything. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. I have not picked up any specific question on. Oh, there is one. Muhammad Khalifa is asking, what is the difference between water management and water governance? I think that is your next phase of the presentation. Am I mistaken? Yeah. Muhammad, you're getting ahead of yourself here.
No. This is certainly obviously the person that was asking that question is paying attention, and but I would say beg for his or her indulgence, for me to continue unfolding that. The reason why I'm doing that in this particular way is because I would like to confer how can I say that? I would like to confer the audience the impression that we need to understand what is management to understand what is governance, and vice versa, in order to identify at which level the problem might be, right? To fix it. Because, you know, sometimes we fix or we identify the problem where there is no problem, or we think that the problem is in one particular, let's say, instance or part of the puzzle, and it's not. So what is it causing the problem in a particular country, in a particular river, in a particular district, in a particular region? Is it the management itself, or is it the governance, right? And this is what I'm trying to unfold here in this presentation. So just wait, and then as soon as you, Clara, gave me permission, I will continue with my presentation, unfolding this idea of management and getting more into the governance.
Thank you, Alejandro. I think you have my permission indeed, as if you needed one. But yeah, so let's go on into this journey of understanding now the links and the differences between one and the other. Yeah, and I think you will also clarify the importance of those 4 dimensions of the IWRM, you know, especially in terms of the connections between the spatial scale and the temporal scale, and understanding both the resource and its user. So please carry on. I'm all ears, and I'm sure all of our audiences as well. Thank you.
Excellent. So, and here we are. So there was someone asking about the distinction between management and governance. And I think one way or the other, the answer is very straightforward. What comes first is an issue, it's like an issue, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And I would say, is it management, is it governance, or is it governance for management, or management for governance? What I would say is that water governance is not an end in itself, but it is a mean to an end. And the mean to the end that we would like to achieve is effective water governance, effective water management. So in other words, you need governance to get good water management, right? It's not the other way around. It's actually governance which leads you to have good water management. And I will describe that in greater detail in a moment. Because if you do not address the underlying governance issues in a particular country, region, basin, district, or worldwide, you will certainly have a number of problems to get good water management. Addressing those underlying governance issues are essential to delivering effective water management. Scarcity, from whatever aspect you see that, physical water scarcity, economic, financial scarcity, and so on and so forth. Economic water scarcity is one key aspect for delivering or for having good water governance, but it's not the only one. And I will refer later on to the others. The effects of not having good water governance are many. One of them is that demand can exceed supply, and this could be the result of old or obsolete legislation. It could be the result of having an inadequate framework for distributive governance arrangements. It could be that there is an inadequate monitoring and compliance mechanisms in the policies, in the law, to deliver this water demand and supply balance. Bad or weak water governance can lead to ineffective pollution prevention and control because, for example, the sanctions and the penalties in the law are inadequate to be enforced, because there is an inefficient system to enforce procedural rights, meaning access to justice, meaning access to environmental information, meaning limited public participation. It might be because you do not have good mechanisms for resolving conflicts between users and service providers. And last but not least, weak water governance can reveal or can have the effect of leading to institutional incoherence. So these are some of the effects of not having a good water governance system can lead to. But in order to understand how to address these potential problems, we need to understand, first of all, the key or the main aspects of water governance. If not, how are you going to resolve the problem if you do not understand the problem? Governance can be defined in various ways. I'm just here proposing one that is taken from one of our tools. Is a political, social, economic, and administrative system which directly or indirectly affects development, use, and management of water and the delivery of services at different levels. There you see inherently in this working definition, I insist, not the only one, the relationship between the political, the social, the economic, and the administrative system and the management of the resource. In other words, how all this system leads and influences the good or effective management of this particular resource. The main aspects of this concept of water governance are the policies, in other words, the formulation and implementation of water policies, of water laws, and water institutions, the need to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the different agencies of the government and the civil society, as well as the corporate and the private sector. Also, the need to establish principles of allocation and distribution of the resource among different users, and a system of rights or permits, licenses, prices, taxes, quantity, quality, standards, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a lot, but all this is something that under this aspect or under this umbrella of water governance, we need to cover to be able to deliver ultimately good water management. Because I insist, governance is not an end in itself, but a mean to deliver something else, and this is management. And I don't want to overcomplicate you so that you leave this webinar and say, I didn't understand anything. But I think this is a complex issue, and my only objective here is not to complicate it unnecessarily, but at least to unfold some of the complexities that are inherent to it. And one of the complexities that is associated to unfolding water governance relates to the fact that addressing water governance is dealing with an issue of capacities. What I have seen in all these years, of working in different continents, in different basins, in different jurisdictions, is that water governance cannot be resolved, or the quest of water governance cannot be resolved if not effective capacities are in place. In other words, capacities as the level of competence of a given group or a society to be able to implement the water management arrangements through the necessary policies, through the necessary laws, through the necessary institutions and implementation and mechanisms in a coordinated manner. And therefore, try to remember that, try to think about your own realities, the places where you work, and understand if the capacities are in place, because capacities are always limited. No matter if you are a Nobel Prize, always your capacities are limited. And your governance capacities are also limited. And therefore, do we have at the end of the day the necessary capacities to implement all these arrangements and thus deliver effective water management? This is the main question of the puzzle. And here, in this graphic, you can see the way in which we have been trying to illustrate in the core or in the center of this graphic what are the different dimensions that water governance has in terms of water governance capacity. Policy, the inner circle, followed by the circle of the law, followed by the circle of the institution, and followed by the circle of the enabling environment, the enabling conditions of regulations, contracts, compliance, and other implementation mechanisms that I will unfold once we have had the opportunity to answer any questions you might have, or at least make or have a break for me to drink a sip of water. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. This part was also very, very interesting. Again, there's so much a reminder of all the discussions that we had in the natural resources field. So I'm not going to go any further. We have a few important questions and comments as well. So I see two raised hands. I will give the word first to Vishwa. If you could please introduce yourself before you ask the question, so we know who you are and what's your scope of work and where you're from, and then you're welcome to ask the question. I will unmute you now, Vishwa. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Dr. Alejandro. My name is Vishwa. I work on the transboundary water governance issues in Asia region, mostly focusing on South Asia. I have been working with Dr. Alejandro for 5-6 years now, and it has been, based on the learning from him, we are trying to do some work in the Meghna River Basin between Bangladesh and India, using benefit sharing as a principle to build transboundary dialogue. So this is a very brief introduction. On my question, I think I have already, Dr. Alejandro has already answered it. But what we see is that governance, the definition of governance itself includes both the policy and management aspects, like as already Dr. Alejandro said. But in reality, what we have seen is that even if sometimes the policies like very much detailed implementation in transboundary context becomes very difficult, because generally there is consensus and capacities are the main issues, some of which you have highlighted. So I just wanted to share it with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishwa. Thank you. Alejandro, would you like to comment to Vishwa's?
I will just say thanks for that, and I think it's Vishwa has highlighted very important issues here. It's nothing much to be said. What I realized, and perhaps I should have said that at the very beginning, is that when we try to disentangle some of these issues of in this particular case, management vis-a-vis governance, and within governance, the different dimensions, it's sometimes a bit difficult to distinguish them or dissect them as if you are doing a kind of a medicine or anatomical analysis of all these different dimensions. And I will certainly refer to some of those issues that were mentioned by Vishwa in a couple of minutes, when I start talking about the policy, about the different elements of the policies and the laws and so on and so forth. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of gray areas there. And sometimes, cannot be seen as perfect as you will probably see them in this presentation. Not saying that my presentations is perfect, but what I'm trying to transmit to you is in a very schematic way, what are the different components, what are the different dimensions, what are the different elements. And sometimes when you get to the local realities of the countries where you live, the jurisdictions where you work, you will say that this is missing, that this is repeated, that this is overlapping. Well, this is the reality of governance, this is the reality of the world, and the reality of the world is that it is imperfect. And water management and water governance is still imperfect. So what I'm trying to say is the moment in which we understand all these different dimensions, but we contextualize them to the different realities, is when we will start understanding where might be somewhere there a bottleneck that we will need to address. But perfect is nothing, and the world for sure not. Thank you.
Thank
you for your intervention.
Thank you for this. I think it leads into a comment that was made by Dr. Sharon Pollard, who's based here in one of my neighbors, so to speak, although a couple of 100 km away. Dr. Sharon Pollard is the head of the award, which is a local NGO on water governance, done a lot of work in transboundary water governance in the region. Sharon, I think your comment follows up very nicely with the discussions that is happening here. Do you want to unmute yourself and share your points with Alejandro and the audience? Sharon? Maybe she can't. Maybe she can't. Okay, so while we wait for the Pradeep also had a raised hand. Pradeep, I'm going to unmute you if you want to ask your question to Alejandro before we move on. Seems like nobody can talk. I hope it's not a glitch in the system.
Hopefully a technical problem, no?
Yeah, I did unmute you, Sharon, so that's why I don't understand why. Let me try again. Unmute. Okay, Sharon, you're unmuted.
Unmute. Okay. This is Pradeep from Nepal.
Okay.
I'm working as a Chief Executive Officer in FNCCI. Now I left that job and now I became a freelance consultant for the World Bank and other components in Nepal, other donors in Nepal. My question to the presenter is about the capacity of the government. The water use can be determined by the capacity of the government. So the government, if the government is not aware of the multiple use of water, including hydropower and irrigation, and the nearby users or the stakeholders nearby the water sources are now the government's liability is to educate them about the use of water and not to pollute the system. This is what the government is supposed to do. But I can give you the example of Nepal and India. We have water sources in Nepal, and that is flown to India without any control, and that means the pollution is there, and the water users, nearby users, they don't know about the purity and the use of the water. So it is it is flown to India without any control by the law of the government of Nepal. And the Nepal government is also very weak in compared to India, that water, whatever found in Nepal is used mostly in India at many purposes. And in the summertime, when we have lots of water in the river, the Indian government is now control the flow of water to India. If it is not controlled, some cities of India nearby to Nepal will be flooded. So it is controlled and it should be controlled. But in the winter time, when we use water and we need most of the water found in the river is now flown to India. Without the Nepal government does not have that capacity to control the river and flow to India and use the water resources in within the country. This is the challenge of Nepal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. I think what you're discussing is a clear example of what can go wrong in a transboundary water context. Alejandro, have you any comment for Pradeep before I give the word quickly to Sharon?
No, I mean, it's nothing much to be said except to thank for the intervention and for this particular case, which I'm a bit familiar with, not too much, but I have done some work with my colleagues in the region in South Asia. But this is certainly a situation, or a situation like this happens around the world in other regions, but in South Asia, in which you have different levels of capacities, I would say, of countries and societies to deal with the necessary water governance arrangements to secure, effective water management within the countries, and also vis-a-vis your neighbors when waters are shared or are transboundary, and so on and so forth. And this, in a way, this case reinforces my message that dealing with water governance is at the end of the day and ultimately dealing with an issues of capacities to be able to implement all the necessary arrangements to deliver effective water management. So I am sure that we will get back to these issues, a bit later on in this presentation, but also in the upcoming seminars when we get more and more into transboundary issues. It's a very good example, but as I said, it's not only an example that can be predicted to the relationship between Nepal and India. I am sure you have also interesting examples in Africa, in Latin America, in Central America, in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I think Sharon's comment was really more about bringing in the discussion the Southern Africa experience. Sharon, I'm going to try and unmute yourself again now. Unmute you again now. There you go.
Great. Thanks, Clara. Alejandro, thanks. Very nice to hear a talk on governance. Not many people want to actually address the issues of governance. I was just thinking as you were talking around capacity, and we spend an awful lot of time working on capacity, but one of the things that's emerged for us in the region, and I don't think it's unique to Southern Africa, is political economy of water. And what I mean by that is, water is power. Once you have the power to issue water use licenses to certain sectors, I mean, you start introducing issues of political interests and political power. And, with that, often it opens up a scope for, I suppose in the worst case scenario, it can be corruption, but it's inequalities around access to power. And I think we're seeing a lot of the problems we're seeing emanate from this kind of jostling for power and these kind of hidden interests, particularly as water becomes more and more scarce in the region. And I think it's often not named because it's quite a difficult issue to tackle. And I think more and more people are going to have to start looking and naming this as a key issue. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on that.
Alejandro?
Yes.
Thank you, Sharon.
Look, this is certainly a very interesting comment and remark. And I know what you're talking about. And I will try to refer to some of these issues, in the next couple of minutes. That in my presentation we have a couple of slides still to cover, and I hope that I can cover some of the issues that you are referring to. But I mind you, this is just an introduction to water governance. Is certainly not an advanced course on water governance. I take note of these important issues that you're mentioning, and I know that they become even more exacerbated in contexts in which scarcity is an issue. I have seen that also in my work in Latin America, in the Andes, in jurisdictions like Peru, in jurisdictions like Bolivia, in jurisdictions like Ecuador. I have seen that also, some examples without being directly involved. In India, in the Himalayas, the issue of power, the issue of inequalities, that become even more exacerbated whenever it gets into context of scarcity or uneven distribution of the resource. Let me try to continue with my presentation and see if I can shed some light into that. And if not, I am sure that if not in the context of this particular webinar, or perhaps afterwards, we might continue having a discussion on that. Because if not, I don't think that we will be able to cover all the other issues that I have to cover today. Thank you very much for that point. Yeah, it's a very good comment.
Thank you to all the participants, and Alejandro, I agree. This is just the beginning of a 7-week series, so don't get ahead of yourself, and you might find some of the answers coming later on as well. But it's interesting, I think it speaks to the importance of the issue and how relevant it is, how water is associated to power struggles as well in some areas of the world. So please go ahead, Alejandro, and we look forward to the next part of your presentation. Thank you.
With the idea that I will never forget, all these questions. We will deal with them one way or the other, either in the context of this presentation or later on the bilateral way. No matter. Don't worry, I'm not going to forget that. Thank you. So, next station is policy. Remember when I propose not a definition, but the different components of water governance, or the key aspects. I said that one of the main aspects is the policy dimension, or the policy aspect. And here is something that we will have to disentangle a little bit to understand what is policy. And I think that African countries like Southern Africa certainly understand very well the distinction between policy, legal frameworks, because in this quest that you have gone through by way of reforming the whole water governance system in your countries, you have gone through the different steps, in a very sequential and logical, I would say, way, by way of preparing the policy and the blueprint that the policy really entails before making the legal reform, which is certainly not the case in every single jurisdiction around the world. And I'm saying that because some of the participants to this webinar will probably say, wait, but in my country, we do not have a policy written or a policy set of principles written, but we have a law. Or other participants might say, wait, Alejandro, we have a water policy recently adopted, but our water laws or our water legislation date back to the 1950s, to the 1960s, or is dispersed between different acts regulations, laws, codes, and so on and so forth. This is part of the reality of water governance around the world. Here, what I'm again trying to condense in this presentation is, I would say, methodologically an ideal case scenario in which the policy precedes the adoption of the law, and then we will see what we would need to adopt or to implement the law that adopts the policy blueprints or the policy principles. So let's start with the policy in the understanding that policy itself can be considered a blueprint for drafting and amending the laws. And it is certainly, and you also will agree with me, that it is an opportunity, if it is done in a proper way, obviously, for a meaningful public consultation in the development of new laws. Because by way of preparing that blueprint, you unfold a number of critical issues that will have to be subject of a legal reform afterwards if the process is properly done. At the end of the day, I would say that the main role of policy in this particular context, water governance, is to facilitate the legislative and the institutional reform. Policy, it can be said, that promotes the coordination of actions and activities of other government agencies, not only the water governance agencies, not only those departments that relate to water per se, but that are relevant for water management. This is also part of the policy role. And guidelines, you might know some of them, the guidelines that are contained in policy documents, at the end of the day, can also be used by courts, by tribunals, to interpret the statutes, to interpret the laws, to take decisions, can also be used by the decision makers to apply and to enforce environmental statutes, environmental laws, and can ultimately also be used for compliance with environmental statutes, not only with water statutes. So that is the important role that water policy has within this puzzle of water governance. But how is policy normally expressed? Policy is normally expressed as objectives. It's normally expressed through principles that in a way codify policy objectives. Here, I'm not proposing an exhaustive list of what these water policy principles are. I'm just including what I think, in my humble view of the matter, are probably the most important. One of them is transparency. Transparency is certainly key to a modern, key to a progressive, key to a forward-looking water policy nowadays. The same as far as certainty is concerned, the same about accountability is concerned, the same about public participation is concerned, the same about I said accountability, public participation, certainty, and transparency are concerned. Having said all of that, having spoken about principles of water policy, I hope, because this is at least what I was thinking about when I prepared this presentation, that you will start thinking, and what about the law? And what about the relationship between the policy and the law? In other words, do I need a law to work together or alongside these principles of policies? Do I need a law if I have a good policy in my country or not? And before doing that, let me introduce the main features of the law to be able to respond to that question that hopefully is in your heads at the moment. The main thing when we talk about the law is that we need to think about transformation of policy into clear rules and to clear procedures. And that's probably the easiest and the most straightforward answer to that question you might have. The moment in which you embed the policy into a legal document, you transform those policy objectives into clear rules, into clear and enforceable procedures that are of an obligatory nature. But that does not mean that water law is crafted in stone and will never be modified and certainly will never be amended. Clearly, law vis-a-vis policy, as a matter of fact, is much more, let's say, difficult to be amended because, as you know, law is adopted through a process that normally goes through an assembly and to a parliament and requires a certain procedures, a certain discussions for its ultimate adoption. The policies are, I'm not saying necessarily too easy to adopt, but do not require that procedure within an assembly or within a parliament, and therefore have more flexibility essentially in their adoption and in their implementation. But water law in modern times certainly needs to combine that precision that it is inherent to the law, precision that has to do with the very nature of a legal text, with the flexibility that is required to govern or to manage ultimately a resource within context of scarcity, within context of climate change, within context of insecurity, and so on and so forth. But no matter how precise law is, how flexible law could be, it is important that concise and coherent laws avoid ambiguity in interpretation and application. And this is essential in the law. Law has to strive for avoiding ambiguity and avoiding that confusion, because if not, what happens after that? You have conflicts in implementation, you have conflicts in application. And if ultimately the law is supposed to transform the policy objectives into mandatory requirements, ultimately, if the law is ambiguous, the law makes fuzzy the application of the policy objectives in a country. That's why it is so important to understand the interrelationship between a policy objective and a legal requirement. And why is important to have a strong policy objective, but also an unambiguous legal requirement that transform or translate that policy objective into a legal obligation. Ultimately, and that's why I put it here in italics, water law should serve the higher purpose within the overall governance system of a country, which is environmental justice, which is distributive justice around a country, within a basin, within a community, or if you would like to say it, worldwide. This is the ultimate objective of water law. But water law also, as water management, has been evolving over the years. It's not that the water law that we have At the moment, you know, it's the subject or has been not the subject of different iterations of reforms. In other words, water law has evolved the same way as water management. You know, all these different stages in which that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation have infused the development of water law. So nowadays, water law reforms will have to obviously reflect the realities of water management around the world, have to reflect issues that have to be with distribution, with scarcity, with indigenous and local communities, with climate change, with melting of glaciers, with accidents, or with the combinations of all of that. Probably in the 1960s or in the 1970s, water law didn't look at those issues that much as we have to look at them nowadays. But what I would like to say with this idea of water law reform is that this idea of reform or modernization of water law started strongly in the 1990s. And this is something that can be considered a movement to review existing water laws, which is by far not completed because there are many countries that still have not been able, even if there has been a reform in place or a reform started, to enact a comprehensive legislation to govern water resources in the countries. Countries have been able to complete, some countries have been able to start, some countries have only got up to the point of having different, proposals in the parliament. Some countries have been able not to pass the legislation because of conflicting views and conflicting interests. Why is it so? Because ultimately, new or modern water laws have to look at issues relating to distributional equity, have to look at not only the water resource per se, like in the past, like in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, but environmental protection overall, efficiencies in allocation, and securities of legal tenure in the face of obviously volatile and shrinking resource bases as far as water is concerned. That's why water law reform, still being important nowadays, are becoming more and more difficult to be put forward. Certainly, all these need to lead to something that lawyers have been trying to get through, especially in these times, which is coherent legal system. Coherent legal system as far as water is concerned. A coherent legal system that can help to deliver ultimately, and as I said, because this is the ultimate goal of water governance, which is water management. And this coherency is something that has to be predicted, not only on issues relating to rules of appropriation, water rights, but also, as I previously said, the relationship or the interrelationship of water with other areas, trying to reflect ultimately what we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, the IWRM goal. Also, the idea of the basin as the main, so to say, the most adequate scale to manage the water, and also to have this idea of conservation of water resources, promoting the conservation, not only through systems that look at command and control, but those that have to look at more market-based incentive types. So what I'm saying with all of this is that law reforms are important. Law reforms have been recognized in the 90s, but this idea of having coherent legal systems that come or ultimately derive from law reform are not easy to be achieved. Why? Because it's a difficult exercise. that needs to look at different scenarios and different angles to become something that delivers effective management. Having covered all this, let's say, the realm of the policy, the realm of the law within the governance, there is the next piece of the puzzle, which is the institution. And the institution, as far as water governance are concerned, are a key piece of the puzzle, because the institutions are the ones that will be able to move from the water policy and the legal reform to the implementation to achieve effective water governance and management, right? You will have there an agent, so to say, if you want, the agent of implementing, which is the institution, and now we will see which institutions are we talking about, that will be able to move from the blueprint of the policy through the legal rules into the implementation to deliver IWRM. That's why institutions are key. That's why to be able to deliver effective water management, you do not only need the policy and the law, but the agents of the change, which are the water institutions. And water institutions are multiple and act at different levels. Water institutions exist at local level, at district level, for example, at municipal level, exist at national level, exist at basin level, exist at regional level, Southern Africa, for example, with SADC, and exist at global level. So there is a multiplicity of institutions in the water sector, as you can see in this slide, that coexist and have multiple mandates to govern a complex resource across the spectrum of local all the way to the global level. Here you can see in this classification, which is certainly not the only one, not the final one, it's just an attempt to make it visible for you what could be the different institutions from different levels. And if you look at these classifications starting from the top, are, let's say, the higher level interstate, interbasin commissions, for example, with some examples on the right-hand side of the table, all the way down through river basin authorities, water ministries, water authorities, national ministries, water councils, water agencies, water sub-ministerial authorities, all the way to water users associations. All these are different examples of what we could speak or what we could consider, grosso modo, water institutions. You will have all these slides with you to reflect further on that, to reflect on the different roles, to reflect on the different features, to reflect on the different examples that I'm proposing here. What I would like to propose in the few minutes that we still have available so that we do not run out of time is some of the key functions that water institutions have in this realm of water governance. Again, this is a non-taxative list of key functions, of water institutions. Just to mention, planning of water resources is certainly inherent to water institutions. Managing or administering water rights is certainly inherent to water institutions. Sometimes it is conduction of research, planning, monitoring, inspection, managing conflict resolutions, enforcing laws and regulations, and so on and so forth. There might be more. It varies according to the type of institution. So to say, the higher the level of the institution, the more complex the functions could be, because they have to look at a more ample set of issues, but in essence, all the institutions have to do with planning, and with management of water resources, in the understanding that they respond to a law that one way or the other permeates the policy principle. And what, at the end of the day, we have to say, and this is in a way to conclude this idea of water governance, or the whole puzzle, is that we do not only need the policies, we do not only need the laws and the institutions, but we also need a set of enabling environment requirements that help implementation. And these enabling environment requirements that will foster and help the implementations are, for example, issues that will have to deal or will address, for example, corruption, will address transparency, will address accountability, will address other issues like, for example, power, as we were discussing before. So this enabling environment is precisely defined by those issues. And it is within this enabling environment that the policies, that the law and the institutions operate. And in order to be effective, this enabling environment needs to exist, right? This is also part of the governance realm. And this is also part of the problem why sometimes management of water fails. That's why I've been insisting so much along this presentation in showing you all these different elements, all these different dimensions, not to say this is the solution, but at least to show you where you have to look to find the problem, make the diagnostic of the problem, and then address the solution at the right place. Because sometimes you would like to resolve the issue not where the problem is, but in another problem, and then at the end of the day, you do not resolve it. 2 words about enabling implementation, which is the issue of regulations. And this is something that has to be said also in this context. And here, rapidly, what I would like to say is that there are, basically speaking, 2 different ways to enable implementation through regulation. One is the system of command and control. Here, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is via mandatory rules with sanctions and punitive sanctions, trying to get implementation by way of saying, you do that. And if you don't do that, there is a penalty to that. That's why you call it command and control, the sticks, the famous sticks. The other side, or a complementary way of trying to enable implementation via regulation, is using the voluntary basis, the incentives, using taxes, using, I don't know, compensations, using payments for ecosystem services, using so many other systems that do not necessarily follow this idea of the sticks, the command and the control. And this is what we call the voluntary mechanisms. All of them, at the end of the day, what they are trying to do is ensuring implementation of the laws and the policies. Another word has to be said here in this context to finalize my presentation is the idea of compliance and enforcement. And this is something that is absolutely inherent to law, is inherent to the institution, is inherent to governance, and fundamental to deliver effective management. Compliance and enforcement normally come together, but these are 2 concepts that, in my view, have to be distinguished. And again, I insist on distinguish them for you to see in your particular context what is really working or what might not be working in order to address the plausible solution. When you talk about compliance, you talk about acting according to what the law says or what the regulation says. Enforcement means compelling the observance or being obedient with what the law or what the regulations are imposing. Are the two different sides of the same coin. Compliance and enforcement come together, but means two different things. And the state might use even the police action to ensure compliance with a specific law. And this is something that you need to understand. And this is something that also is predicted to vis-a-vis water resources. Enforcement mechanisms, normally, if someone asks you, when are you going to enforce the law, the water law, you go to court. Yeah, that's true. If there is a contravention of the law, then you will try to ensure justice by going directly to the court. But these are mechanisms that are not necessarily limited to state or to administrative actions, but can also enable enforcement actions by the citizens. And in my experience, I will say, the most effective enforcement mechanism is rendered by well-funded and well-resourced administrative systems that are also overseen by accessible and by affordable judicial systems. Again, when you are trying to identify where the problem might be, is it a problem in the enforcement? Is it a problem in the compliance? Is it a problem further upstream in the law itself? Or is it the problem in the confusion of the different institutions that are in charge of implementing the policy and the law, or so on? That's why, I've been trying in this presentation to provide you, in a way, with different elements showing the different dimensions and interactions of these concepts of governance on the one hand, management on the other side. How are they interrelated for you to be able to understand the complexity, for you to be able to identify the problems in your own jurisdictions, and before concluding, and we will have perhaps time for some questions, say that management, with all its complexities, needs to start with a vision. You cannot have effective management of a given water resource if you do not start with a vision. And every vision starts probably with a dot. But then you require good governance, relying on clear policies, on the coherent laws, on strong and solid institutions and the enforcement mechanisms that, as I said, to be able to transform effective management from a vision into a reality. Remember, as I said, governance is not an end in itself, but is a means to an end. And the end is water management. But this idea of water governance as a delivery mechanism for water management is in constant update and progress. Needs evolution, needs new laws, needs new policies. That's why we spoke about water law reforms. Needs to be flexible. Now needs to address issues like scarcity, power, climate change, COVID, if you want. Essentially, and with this I would like to conclude, building water governance, building strong water governance mechanisms is, as the gentleman said, the one that spoke about Nepal, is an issue of capacities. Don't forget that aspect. You might have the perfect system of visions, of policies, of laws and institutions, plus the enforcement mechanisms, but if you do not have the necessary capacities in place, the whole puzzle collapses. A final word, just to show you two important resources for reference for you. One is called RULE, Reforming Water Governance, that has all these, what I have mentioned, amplified in much more greater detail, and one which is called Governance of Shared Waters, which is the one that we will be using for the next webinar, if you bear with me for next week. And with this, I conclude my presentation. If you have some time for questions, comments, I will be more than happy to answer them. Sorry for extending myself a little bit, but I hope that at least with all of this, you will get the essentials of water governance. And thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Alejandro. There are indeed questions, and there are also apologies for people who had to leave early and they were still interested in hearing more, but they had other meeting schedules. And I'm very sorry, because one of those people is actually representing one of the river basin organization of Southern Africa, which is of the Ofcom River, one of the biggest ones. But she'll come back. She'll come back, so don't worry.
I probably underestimated, you know, the timing. It was, I mean, we are right with the time, but not much time for the questions and the answers. Up to you, Clara, to manage all this. Let me know. I'm here.
Thank you. We also had a lot of discussions earlier, so it's not just up to you. You know, like when the situation and when the discussions are interested, it's also good to share the knowledge and to share the experiences. So that's what we did, and some people have agreed to stay a little bit longer to just conclude this very interesting first session. So I'm not going, in the interest of time, I'm not going to give the voice to people to answer the question, to ask their own questions, mainly because we have two that are relating to each other in any case. So Liliana Pimentel from Brazil, she's asking if you know of the interesting models in Brazil based on the French model for water committees, and what do you know or think of them? And related to that, an earlier question from Carolyn McCurdy, who was asking if, in your opinion, there exists an exemplary water basin that is very well managed under a very good water governance model that is worthy of examination and potential imitation, and if so, which one is it? So I'll while you think about the answer, the very complex answer to these two, I was just gonna look if there's any more questions, but no.
I don't know the answer to Liliana. No, I don't know that, but I mean, I will be more than interested in knowing that. So if there is a way to share this, to exchange some communications with the French committees that Liliana Pimentel is mentioning, I will be more than happy to get to know that. Answer is no. The second one, I didn't understand very much the question, Clara. If you can repeat that, please.
Ooh, sure, of course. I'll read you the question as Carol wrote it to us. In your opinion, is there an exemplary water basin in the world where there is a water governance model worthy of examination and potential imitation? If yes, what is it about governance of that basin that makes it successful?
A basin in particular. Ooh, many, but it's difficult to say. I mean, I was going to mention that if the person that asked that question is going to attend the next seminar, I will elucidate that question in my next seminar when we speak about some of the basins that I'm going to give examples about. I don't want to give all the not to say specifically why and if and so, but I would refer to the Rhine Basin here in Europe as a good example of bad, good governance, good collaboration, bad collaboration, effective collaboration, different layers. So I will ask that person to participate in the next webinar in which I will refer to the Rhine. But there are several ones, smaller basins, you know. I will speak about, for example, the Scheldt here in Europe. I will speak about some of the lake basins, you know, for example, the context of Switzerland and Germany, good collaboration there, but also in the developing countries. Sometimes, we tend to think that in the developing world, because of all the challenges associated with natural resources management, our basins are degraded, polluted, and so on and so forth. But there are also very good examples, even not in the full range or in the full picture, but important advances, that I have seen also in the developing world, like in the Volta, for example, in West Africa, or in Eastern Africa, in some of the Great Lakes, in which even then, if there are some difficulties associated to managing resources, there are some important advances in terms of water governance. Probably the full spectrum, of having the basin itself well managed and well governed is a process. And that's why I was referring to the Rhine, in which you had divisions, you had wars, you had accidents, you had pollution, and now you have a basin that is well managed, but you have to go through enormous problems historically to arrive to the point in which we are now, which is a basin that is well managed, well funded, well administered, and well governed. Right? It's a quest. It's part of a puzzle. It's a quest, part of an evolution.
Thank you. There is one final question from Himadri, who asks, how do we consider the habitat in the water and the water ecosystem and also the people in the aspect of law and policies?
So the first, can you repeat that again? Because I didn't hear you very well, Clara. How do you consider?
The habitat in the water and the water ecosystem, and also the people in the aspects of law and policies.
Right. So I guess that this is in a way indicating or suggesting an important point in this question, which is the issue of basin. And I guess, again, we will certainly unfold this further during this series of seminars. In a modern legislation, in a modern law, in a modern policy, and probably, your own country, Clara, South Africa, is a good example of that. When you speak about basin, when you speak about that as the adequate or the most adequate level in which the water resources are managed, within that concept, you entail not only the water, but also all the different interrelationships between water and other natural resources, plus the different people, plus the different interactions of people, of water and the other resources. In other words, within the modern concept of basin, that has to be reflected in policy and in law, I will say habitats, I will say species, I will say ecosystems, people, and their interrelationships should be embedded, considered, reflected, entailed, absorbed, however you want to call it. Has to be considered under that, so to say, concept, right? And this is part of what the new water law reforms are trying to strive, are trying to go. Not water alone, but water in relation to, including people, ecosystems, and habitats.
Thank you. There is one final question, which is a very complex question, Nathan.
I thought that was the last one, but now we have another one. No problem.
We have another one. I'm sorry. But this is going to be the last one.
I'm here. Excellent.
I think the topic of this question is also going to unfold in your presentation next week, and also through the other presentations across the series. But Nathan, I hope you don't mind, I'll read it, and again, it's just a matter of time.
No
Nathan
problem.
asks, certainty is challenging, practically impossible to obtain in any water system because of climate uncertainty, socio-political uncertainty, infrastructure uncertainty, etc. How then do we obtain a high level of certainty for any transaction? I agree certainty in policy or law is important for stakeholder investment. It is just challenging to establish certainty in a natural system.
Yeah.
More of an ecology question.
What else do you want me to say? For sure, he's absolutely right. Certainty is an issue, an absolute certainty you never have. In life, you have to manage different levels of uncertainty. And I think this is part of life, right? Part of life, not only in as far as water is concerned, but part of life as far as anything is concerned. We manage uncertainty all the time, right? The thing is, when these levels, I would say, and let me see if I can express that correctly, especially from the angles of a non-scientist or only on a legal scientist, if I may say that. It's a matter of managing or reducing the levels of uncertainty in order to have a certain manageable uncertainty, if you know what I mean. And this is what law, at the end of the day, tries to do. Law is not going to respond or to give you a full response to the uncertainty that is around managing natural resources, but we'll try to codify, we'll try to bring to the minimum common denominator human behavior that repeats over time with certain levels of certainty and codify it in a way that serves the purpose, so to further, so to say, behaviors are regulated to avoid conflicts, to make sure that living in a society, as far as resources are concerned, is doable, and at the end of the day, try to bring some solutions to all these levels of uncertainty. But I agree, law is not the only mechanism or the only tool that you can use to manage these levels of uncertainty. You will always have uncertainty, and even more now, because you have, who could say that at the beginning of this year, in January, we will end up being where we are now, living, in a world full of lockdowns, and full of pandemics that are getting in first waves or in second wave. This was completely uncertain. I remember, traveling until March. I was about to visit my parents in March, trying to embark from Europe there. And my father said, stop. And I said, what? Stop, don't even get, because you might not even enter. Was it certain in January that something like that was going to happen? For sure not. The same happens with climate change. The same happened, with patterns of behavior of species, availability of water as a result of all of that. So, managing uncertainty, living with levels of uncertainty, I think is part of the bread and butter of today's world and today's life. Hope, one way or the other, I was able to respond to this very important point that Nathan, if I understood that correctly, was trying to make sure, and certainly is something that we will have to address, or we will continue addressing in the follow-up seminars next week and the weeks after.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Alejandro.
Very good point. It's a very interesting point, but sure requires a discussion from a multiplicity of disciplines. And as I said, I'm trying to see that from my limited lenses of the legal, so from the legal lenses, right? How is the relationship of uncertainty with law, you know, and how law can contribute to managing uncertainty and provide more certainty, but without resolving the whole problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think no science in its own right can resolve a problem that is pertaining to complexity in any case. And I think this is more in the field of something called disaster risk reduction. So bringing together different sciences, different tools, different approaches, and certainty in what we call adaptive management systems that learn from themselves, adapt to what happens.
And that is also, you know, that's why I didn't want to enter into that, Clara, because this is always a fascinating issue, which is the issue of adaptive management, flexibility, and how flexible a law can be, and how flexible a governance system can be to cope with adaptive management, so to say. But to be honest with you, that requires a new webinar. I hope you know
a new webinar series.
That requires certainly a new webinar. And you know, if this is something, you know, that this last question can or has triggered our discussion and our imagination, is that when we speak about adaptation, adaptive management, adaptive governance, flexible system is something that we will have to consider, you know, as a whole new set of issues to be considered within water management and water governance. That was for sure, you know, part of what I wanted to transmit and transfer into this conversation, but for sure beyond the remit of that introduction to water governance. Will have to be done, you know, in a subsequent series or in a subsequent webinar or seminar.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you, and thank you all the participants that have been listening to us, asking these very interesting and challenging questions. And I'm more than happy to have been able or participated into this. And I'm very much looking forward to next week, to those that will join us to continue unfolding, exploring some of these challenging issues, you know, that we have to deal with, you know, in water governance, in transboundary. So because now when we get into the transboundary or to the shared water governance dimension, you know, all these challenges become double, triple, or multiple. So, but that's for next week.
That's for next week, indeed. And we're all looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Alejandro, for your time today, for staying a bit longer. And the same for you, all of you who attended. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And we hope to see you again next week to enter the transboundary governance world. I hope you're going to have a good rest of the day. And the catchphrase in this time is stay safe and have a good time. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.
Bye.
Alejandro?
Bye-bye. Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week. Ciao.